QuickBooks Online 2025, software types and options. Get ready and some coffee because we're learning to save time with QuickBooks Online. And if we save time, we may just save space itself because time is like part of the space-time continuum. Making comparisons between accounting softwares, not just QuickBooks accounting softwares, but any types of accounting softwares, one of the first and primary categories we want to consider is whether we're talking about a desktop software or online cloud-based software. This categorization being important because whether the software is physically on our actual desktop or in the cloud online will have a significant impact on the functionality, how we access, and possibly how we pay for the software. Now, QuickBooks is great for this type of comparison because they have both a desktop version and an online version, allowing us to do that kind of head-to-head comparison with the same company that we can then apply to other softwares, other companies most likely not having both a desktop and online version. They're specializing in essence, one or the other. So we can apply the concepts to a larger scale oftentimes. However, when we're thinking about the QuickBooks world, we're usually thinking about the desktop version as the older version. That's the one that's been around forever. And then the new person on the block, the new software around is going to be the online version, which clearly, especially when we're talking about small to mid-sized companies, Intuit, the owner of QuickBooks, is marketing towards. So small to mid-sized companies, they're really trying to get everybody into the online version. That doesn't mean that the desktop version has basically gone away or that we don't want to understand the advantages and disadvantages of a desktop version, because even within the QuickBooks world, if you have more advanced type of needs, such as in particular inventory needs, you might still be using Desktop Enterprise, for example, for those particular needs, and the concepts that we understand between the two might still be comparable to other types of software packages. So it's important to kind of look at the difference between them. So when we're thinking about Intuit world, QuickBooks in particular, the first categorization we want to think about is, are you talking about a desktop version or an online software version when you're thinking about QuickBooks? Because these distinction is basically two different types of software. The desktop version and online version do in essence the same thing, but how you access them and how you navigate through them looks very, very different. And also, if we were going to move, for example, from the desktop version to the online version, which QuickBooks is often pushing for small to mid-sized businesses, so that might even be an area of specialization at this point in time, or if you're moving from the online version to the desktop version, that's going to be somewhat of a painful move because in essence, you're basically moving to a new software. That's almost as much of a pain as going from a QuickBooks software to a whole different company or something like that, because again, the softwares are quite different, although Intuit is trying to make that transfer specifically from the desktop version to the online version as painless as possible. Now, once you're within either the desktop or online version, there's in essence different tiers, different levels that you can pay for. And that would be kind of like if you just having more functionality, you're paying for more functionality within that particular software. So in our case, we're going to be focusing in on the online software. So the first thing we want to understand is we're going to be choosing the online software rather than the desktop software, which have a really different look and feel to it. Although if you want to follow along with the desktop software, you can still kind of figure it out, but it won't look exactly the same. Once we're on the online software, we have those different tier levels that we can pay for, paying for more functionality. That then is not a move into a completely different software, but rather staying in the same software and paying for, again, more access within that software. So in other words, once we've chosen an online software, the next thing you want to consider is how much functionality you need within that software so that you pick the functionality that's high enough to cover your needs, but not paying for more than you actually need. And if you need to level up in the future, that's usually an easy thing to do. So in other words, maybe you only have 1 or 2 users of the software. If you pick the software that has that lower tier of 1 or 2 users, and then later you need more users, you can pretty easily level up pay more for the added functionality. However, if you start out at the added functionality and you start to get used to using some of the tools that are in that added functionality, realizing, however, that you don't actually need those tools and you want to level back down, that could be more difficult to do, right? It's possibly not as difficult as going from an online software to the desktop software, but because you were using some of those tools in the higher up level, it might be a little bit more difficult to say, hey, I want to tier it back. So just from a practical standpoint, we want to first think, if you're deciding what type of software to apply to your business, do I want a desktop or online software? In our case, we're looking at the online version. Once you've chosen one or the other, in our case online, what's the lowest tier level that I can pay for that covers the needs that I need to basically cover? And then how easy is it for me to level up versus, again, going too high and then trying to level down? All right, so that's going to be our idea here. So we're going to be comparing the two. Now remember that the desktop version of the software for small to mid-sized businesses, Intuit seems to be basically trying to move out of. So want to put that out up front. If you're a small to mid-sized business, you're not going to get the desktop pro as easily as you could before, but you still might see desktop because it's around for the enterprise. All right, so risk of Intuit canceling. That's the first issue with the desktop version. So again, if you're a smaller business, you're going to say, hey, the desktop's going to have an issue because they might cancel the desktop version, which is a painful thing for many bookkeepers because of the different functionality and the way the two software work. The online version clearly seems to be where the QuickBooks and Intuit wants to go based on, their marketing, what they've done thus far. So the desktop version now has a subscription model. So even before they kind of canceled the lower tiers of the desktop version, they went into the subscription model. Now, I just want to give a little bit of history on this so you can get an idea of what has happened over time and how the functionality has changed from desktop versions to online software. Now, you'll recall that most software before this, even if you compare it to like Microsoft Office products like Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, you used to buy those softwares, physically put them on your computer. So the software was on your computer. If you're using Microsoft Excel, the software you can think of in essence on your computer because you've installed it, right? And then you can make as many Excel files that you want from that version, and you don't have to pay more for each of the Microsoft Excel worksheets that you build or workbooks that you build from the software. So that's going to be like the desktop version, similar to the desktop version for QuickBooks, meaning the QuickBooks is like the Microsoft Excel on your computer. And if I want to make multiple QuickBooks files, I can do that without having to pay for each new company file. Now, you can see how that can have a particular business model that is great, because then I just make one purchase of the software and I don't have to purchase new software every time I make a new company file. And that's kind of nice for a particular type of business model. Then they went to a subscription model even for the desktop version of the software. So that meant that if you didn't pay on a yearly basis, then you might not have access again to the software anymore on the desktop version. It's pretty clear, it seems to me, that the subscription model is one of the reasons that Intuit really likes the online version, because what they would like to have happen is every time you start a new company file, they want you to pay for the new for the new company file. So it's not going to be like Excel where you can make as many worksheets or workbooks as you want, but rather you're on the cloud and you're paying for each new company file. So that's going to be the idea of it that they're moving towards. Now, notice that on the desktop version, even if you're in a subscription model, then you could still make multiple company files with that one payment of the subscription. And by the way, that's great for practicing. So even if you have access to like an older desktop version, then that's still a great tool to practice with, because the general double entry accounting system and data input is basically the same. You're not going to have some of the functionality like adding the payroll to it if you needed to do that, or doing inventory, some more advanced inventory needs possibly, but just practicing basic data input into a QuickBooks system, you're not going to have bank feeds. But practicing basic data input, it's a great tool to be using. Okay, so multiple company files for one purchase. That's going to be one of the major benefits, again, for the desktop version. Only one company file per purchase for the online. You can see this is part of the problem with us practicing in the online version. Because if you have your own company file, I don't want to mess that up. So we need a sandbox for us to be practicing in. That's where the QuickBooks Online test drive comes in. That's where possibly a 30-day trial or the free version of a student software comes in. Whereas in the old desktop version of the software, it was easy. It was easy to make a company file. I can make my own company file, give you a backup of it, and you can be exactly where I'm at with it, right? So for our purposes, just for practicing purposes, the desktop version was actually a lot easier to play with. Static backup files versus data stored on the secured server. So if you're going to the online version, when we're in the online version, there's a question about the backups. Now, when we think of backups, there's going to be multiple things that the backups can do for us. Some of them work great with the online version. Some are not as great on the online version. One of the things the backups are for, of course, are not to lose the data. I don't want to lose my data. So if I have the data on my actual computer and the computer dies, my office burns down, then I possibly lose the file unless I have some kind of good backup system in place. Whereas on the online version, the argument is that it's on the Intuit servers. You're on the cloud. You're logging in online into the Intuit servers. There is a physical place where the data is, but it's on Intuit servers, and they theoretically back those servers up quite well. Therefore, the argument is you're less likely to lose the file from the Intuit server, even if you have a good backup system. Now, I think if you have a good backup system, you're possibly pretty good on the static files, just that you don't want to back them up on the same drive that you are using. You want to back them up onto the cloud or something like that, where you store the backups. So, but in any case, that should be easier online. The other thing that we can use the backups for, however, is if we want to test something out. So, for example, if I want to apply a new app or something like that to my QuickBooks system or something like that, or I want to do a data input and test it out or download something or something like that, I can basically make a backup before I do that, and then I can do it. And if something funny happens, I can restore the backup to where it was prior to when I did that. That's a great tool. You can't really do that on the online system as easy. There's some applications that say that they can back things up in a similar fashion, but it's not as easy to do that type of thing. The other thing we can use backups for, if I'm in a teaching situation, is I can back up the file, have a static backup, and allow someone else to restore the file, allowing them to have the exact data that I have at any particular time. Again, that is great for teaching or working with people that are in two different locations in particular, and you want the two, even if you're in the same location on two different computers, and you want the two people to be following along with the same data. Can't do that as easily with the online software because, again, you either have a new company file or you have the desktop practice file, the test drive file. So there are pros, I think, to the desktop version of the backups. However, the online version, hopefully, is actually better at the core thing you first think about with the backups, which is you shouldn't actually lose your data, right? All right, great to practice with. So again, the desktop version is a great tool to practice with because you can make multiple company files, because you can make backups, because you can basically save something and then test it out to see what would happen if you did some crazy thing into the system and then restore it if it messes up. Again, you can't really do that with the online version. Desktop, consistent design, the online version changing a lot. So this is something that I think a lot of older bookkeepers at least, and possibly newer accountants also appreciate from the old version of the desktop version, which is that they have a layout that basically works, and it doesn't change much from period to period. So if you look at the desktop version from like way back when it first started, and you look at the current format of the desktop version, it looks very similar. It basically has the look and feel of the QuickBooks Office before they did the ribbon thing up top and they had all the drop-down menus. So that means that if there's something that comes up that's better, the desktop version isn't going to adapt as quickly, but it's going to be more consistent. Whereas on the online version, because it's web-based, it's basically a website that we're navigating through, they're changing it like constantly. All the time, they're trying to fix something. And I think on the one side, that is really neat. That's really cool. That's really helpful because hopefully they're testing A/B testing, just like you would with a website, to get the perfect design, to get it perfect, and they always can constantly improve it and make tweaks to it. Unfortunately, on the downside, I think it's compared to like checks and balances of a political system, right? You want a political system that has checks and balances in it, because otherwise, if you give too much power to a centralized authority, they just do drastic things all of a sudden sometimes, and that make no sense. Similarly here, it's so easy to change the web page that you're more likely that they're going to make a drastic change you're like, where did that button go? It's like disappeared. I don't know what happened to it. So, and then hopefully they'll fix it at some later point, but that becomes kind of an issue. It's kind of annoying. You go in there sometimes and they've made some drastic change. For a while there, they were changing the whole page to use more modern words. So instead of calling something like the home page, they're going to call it Get Things Done page, right? So it's they're using hip terminology, right? So those things, if hopefully we just handle those things and we say that's why we update this course every year, so that we can handle the constant changing of the way and the look and the feel of the page, as well as integrations possibly with like the bank feeds and other types of software. So it's not just the increased functionality that we need to deal with the online version. It's just the change of the look and feel of the web page that we also have to kind of cope with, which hopefully again will be better, but sometimes they just make changes just to make changes, I think, right? They have to justify all the jobs over there. So enterprise may fit special needs like inventory tracking better. So remember that the desktop version is basically being, in essence, removed for small to mid-sized businesses, which used to be their bread and butter. That used to be main people that use the desktop version. And so that's basically kind of going away now. But they still have the enterprise version. And what the enterprise version does quite well is advanced needs such as inventory tracking. So, and it might have construction companies also have, it's good for that. Although the online version has different functionality that works good there as well. So when you look at the enterprise version, you can think of it as, in essence, QuickBooks that's leveled up to a level of specialization that's going to be more customized to a particular industry, remembering that as bookkeepers, we really want to be thinking about, where do I want to specialize in? What am I doing? If I'm a bookkeeping business, am I specializing in trying to automate things as much as possible? Or do I have a particular industry, like I specialize in inventory, or I specialize in a construction companies and so on? That will help us to design our systems to as best as possible. Otherwise, you might get kind of overwhelmed. So the enterprise version is going to specialize it. If you get really advanced, then you might have to level up out of QuickBooks. Why? Not because everything's going to be different in other accounting software, but because you have more specialized functionality within them. You can customize different things. So that's going to be the idea of the enterprise. So note that the QuickBooks Online, now you have the same question for the online, is going to be, do you think that QuickBooks Online is going to be able to level up their more advanced version, and then they're going to phase out QuickBooks Enterprise? They might be getting there with regards to construction companies and so on, because there's good functionality and projects there. But with the inventory needs, especially more advanced inventory needs, they might still be a little bit of a ways off. But again, that's more of a specialty kind of area. Our major focus here is going to be on the primary functionality. We will be dealing with inventory and with our QuickBooks Online, and we'll see that we could still track inventory with QuickBooks Online. But if you get into things like scanners and more advanced inventory needs, that's when you might need a more specialized software. All right, more difficult to work from different locations. So if the software is actually on your desktop, then it might be more difficult, of course, to access the software from different locations. Now, you might be able to work around that. So if you're working with particularly enterprise, for example, how do you give people access to the software when the software is on a physical server that you own? You have to, it's a little bit more complex to deal with that, but you can still basically do it. Whereas if you're looking at the online version, of course, it's online. It's on the cloud. It's not physically on our computer, but on Intuit's servers. Therefore, you can access it more easily. Now, there's pros and cons with that, because accessing it more easily means that if someone stole your password or something, they could access it more easily. Now, QuickBooks will, of course, Intuit will argue that the online servers are more secure even than your desktop and so on and so forth. But obviously, if they get access to your, and that might be the case if you had a very strong password and you did all the protocols properly so that someone doesn't steal your data. But if they did have access to their software, that's more likely that they can access the online software because they just need to log into it than if it was actually on your desktop, which means you would think, hack into your actual computer in order to then access it on your computer, right? So those are going to be the pros and cons there. Bank feed may be a little more difficult to use on the desktop version. So the desktop version, one of the big new features, of course, with the web-based systems is bank feeds, connecting to the bank, integrating to the bank, pulling in transactions from the bank, helping us to either record transactions or verify transactions that have been recorded with the bank feeds. We'll talk a lot about this more in the future. The other big thing is applications that we'll talk about in a second. So with regards to the bank, this is huge because if I can connect to the bank, I can download the information from the bank. For small businesses, that might allow us to basically build our bookkeeping system and automate it with the information from the bank. Now, there's a lot of exceptions to this in terms of the types of industries. So this gets back to the idea of where is our specialization for our bookkeeping system or our accounting system. If we're a bookkeeper, if we're an accountant, are we specializing in trying to highly automate everything, trying to be, in essence, on a cash-based system with the use of the bank feeds? Or are we in a more specialized area where we're specializing in handling those needs, such as inventory, such as accounts receivable, accounts payable, payroll, all of these things complicating the bank feed system so that we have to do more of accrual type of things. I'm going to try to point that out as we go through our system here, meaning every form that we look at, every transaction that we have, I'm going to ask the question, is this something that can be automated with the bank feeds, or is it something that's not going to be automated with the bank feeds? What kind of industries will those be in, and how can we work around to still make things as easy as possible for the data input side? How can we integrate the bank feeds? And then we'll have a whole nother section just on bank feeds so that we get used to that. All right, and then we've got the add apps. And so the other huge thing with the online software is, of course, we can add different types of applications. Now, the QuickBooks Online is its own accounting software. It has everything you need for general bookkeeping. It already has access to the bank feeds connecting to the bank. That's great. But sometimes you might have more specialized kind of apps that you want to add to it for different types of functionality. And because QuickBooks is cloud-based, there's going to be a lot more people that might want to be generating these types of apps. Now, you've got to be very careful on what kind of apps that you're going to be adding to your QuickBooks system, but the capacity to do that is much higher, of course, with the QuickBooks Online. You're going to have more availability of possibly particular or different apps that you might find useful than in a desktop version of the software typically. That's why the desktop, oftentimes, when you get into more advanced needs, like a like the enterprise or advanced inventory needs, you want to have customization within the software. So in other words, when you're customizing the software, one way you can do that is have third-party people creating apps that can then be integrated with your QuickBooks, which is easier with an online or cloud-based system. The other way is that you're working with a company that customizes your actual version of the software. And that might be easier to do even on a desktop type of version, because you're not looking for a third party to specialize your system, but the actual company to specialize your system, which would be the higher end way to go, the more expensive but more secure way to go oftentimes. All right, so that's just a quick recap of the differences between the two, remembering that here we're on the online version is what we're going to focus in on, and we'll talk more about that shortly.